Good morning, everybody in the room. Good morning, people joining online. Hopefully everyone online can hear clearly. I'm told that the microphones here are in excellent condition, so if any of you have any problems, do raise your hands. My name is Mark Headley, Director of the China-Britain Business Council. Really pleased to be here this morning for this session. Is your data China ready? And I'd like to first of all say thank you to Kingwood and Mallesons for hosting and for providing lovely breakfast and coffee at your new offices, which I think most of us are here at for the first time. We thought that today's the 1st of September, so we thought today would be a great day to run this session. Today is, as many of you may know, is the day that China's
Sorry.
That's okay. Take a seat. The new cross-border data regulations come into force. So it seemed like a great opportunity to look at this in more detail and what it means for businesses. It seems like there's been sort of endless barrage of regulation over the past couple of years around data privacy, data security. We had the PIPL last year and the data security law, and then stretching back to 2017 when the cybersecurity law was first introduced. At CBBC, we get a lot of questions about this from companies. I think generally speaking, there's been a lot of panic among Western businesses operating in China about what all these rules mean for their businesses. Panic that it's sort of it's a way of putting Western companies at strategic disadvantage, and that these companies are going to have their data stolen, they're going to have their IP taken away from them. That this is all bad for business. I had a quick look yesterday just at how many fines and fines for breaches there've been, and I really struggled to sort of find examples of foreign companies that had been fined. Maybe that's just my research skills, but I did see that DiDi had been fined a cool 8 billion this July. So clearly, the authorities in China are serious about implementing this. And some Western companies, the likes of Yahoo and LinkedIn, have cited data regulation as one of the main reasons that they've pulled out of China, although not exactly companies that are setting the world alight in China. So take from that what you will. So what is actually going on? What are the new measures that come into force today? Who is it going to affect? And what should companies do to comply? I believe that our panel are going to answer these questions today. So without further ado, I will hand over to our three speakers. So we have Mark Schwab, Atticus, Zhao, and Jerry Wu from Kingwood Mallesons. I'll let you introduce yourselves, and I think I will. Are you going to go first, Mark?
Yeah, I think so. I'll give a bit of an overview. So Atticus and Jerry are both in Shanghai office. You can hear us okay, because Mark was asking people who couldn't hear if they could hear us. So you guys can hear us, I guess. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So I think we'll kick it off. And so I think Atticus and Jerry, I think we've seen a lot of companies who've had interest, probably not the degree of panic, but Atticus and Jerry have been working a lot, mostly with German companies and a lot of Chinese companies. The UK companies haven't seemed to be that panicky yet. And I think, this idea that it is somehow against foreign companies, that doesn't really make sense. I think the targets are the large aggregators of data, and unfortunately, that definitely isn't Yahoo. But probably it's so. I think compliance is important. It did feel a bit strange doing it today when everything becomes effective on the cross-border transfers, but I guess doing it 2 days earlier would also perhaps not be of much use. So without further ado, I'll just kick it off. Okay. Oh, okay. So just a bit about this So I think today the new thing on 1st September is the cross-border transfers. And I think the data thing, it's a very big topic. And so it does affect different companies in different ways. So I think we'll throw it out to Atticus and Jerry to talk about some of the specific ones. But I think, the people where we've seen most of the questions actually is in the automotive space and manufacturing. And automotive has a lot of specific regulations in place. Retail and e-commerce, we haven't seen as much as I think we should have because they're dealing with personal data. Education and universities, perhaps for me it was curiously enough, they were asking about these kind of data questions years ago already. So it's not really about their IP or anything like that. It was more about these universities that have lots of Chinese students, and when they do outreach or when they collect the information, or they would even do these kind of lotteries where you could win stuff, they had a lot of data questions. So I think education also is a sensitive topic. And then medical technology, we've had quite a few inquiries about that because a lot of things like hearing aids or these things, it does require information to be sent overseas to do the adjustments, and it's personal data and it's sensitive data. And then I think at the end, Mark will, Headley will chair a bit of a Q&A session. So without further ado, I think it kind of kicked off this whole data. And I think today we're talking a little bit more about cross-border, but I think we're happy to discuss, anything. It kicked off early on in 2017 with the cybersecurity law, and that law doesn't affect many foreign companies. At the time, there was a lot of hysteria amongst perhaps Western lawyers and about the media. And I think this is when Mark was talking about people losing their IP, losing their source code, Chinese government hacking into their network. It's a surprise that the Chinese government, if they wanted to do it, would have felt that they couldn't have done it until 2017. So that was a bit of a surprise. But the cybersecurity law really mostly affects people that have an effect on potentially the welfare of the whole Chinese nation. So, whether it's the finance sector, very large SOEs like CNOOC or these very large companies or utilities. And to tell the truth, I've got a bank account in China. I think they should have a cybersecurity law. So obviously hacking is very dangerous. So that came out, and I think there really hasn't been one case against a foreign company on cybersecurity law. So I would encourage people who are really very bored. They could look back at the media reports before. It was going to be the end of the world. Everybody should pull out of China because of the cybersecurity law, and actually it hasn't affected much. I think clients that we've had who have been affected have been digital companies like software as a service companies, and some of their platforms have been used by criminals, and so they have the quite scary national security guys turning up, but it's always been fine so far. But that's a bit of a shock. And so apart from that, and then I think some clients have problems selling their software to certain key industries like banking, finance, etc. So these kind of things, because if it's not safe and secure technology, you can't sell it. Safe and secure technology requires you to do a security assessment, and that will often require you to at least get partial access to the back door, which I think is all realistic and reasonable. But sometimes when China does things, people get nervous, perhaps unwarrantedly. And then I think the next big one was people. I always call it people because I think the people that love people are the happiest people in the world. But anyway, PIPL, I think the thing is, in a very shorthand way, it actually is just a kind of version of GDPR. So I think most clients who are very compliant with GDPR have very little difficulty in matching the PIPL. And so I think again, there was some work to be done. I think this one, I don't know if Atticus or Jerry wants to chime in, but I think the amount of work was limited. Jerry, you're not on mute. What do you feel? Was it easy for most clients to be PIPL compliant?
So PIPL compliance is actually a very huge topic. So, but companies need to consider two main factors. It's about, first of all, is for the external data subjects like consumers like customers, brand fans, as etc. So they wish to reach the compliance of like when they are collecting the personal information of these external data subjects. So this kind of part will be particularly concerned by the authority. The second thing is like the internal data subjects is about so internal employees, like job applicants, candidates as well. So they wish to, the companies normally would not need to like ensure that the employees are satisfied with the general privacy protection things implemented by the company. So this is the two main factors for companies to have the starting point of thinking that to reach the compliance, especially for the privacy protection.
Yeah. I think in shorthand, yeah, it's not a crazy law. It's like GDPR. I think if you look at it, it's got quite large penalties for non-compliance. But I think as a consumer, I think it's actually quite a reasonable law. It's about protecting your rights over your own data. And I think, Europe has very similar laws. I think Japan has similar laws. The Americans don't have similar laws. And interestingly enough, not one American client has approached us about data. So obviously the Americans, it's not on their radar, except for LinkedIn and Yahoo. I guess those guys looking for an excuse. But so PIPL, so I think that was what we've seen there. And that led to a lot of excitement again. And again, I think any fines that have been levied have been against Chinese companies. And I just don't know if it's not reported in the West, but in China, they were closing down these apps. And there were all these apps that were, before PIPL, it was harder for them to take action. These apps would read your emails, listen to you, go over and crawl and take information out of other apps you're using on the phone. And I think it was about 2 years ago, China knocked out 240 of these apps. So I think, these apps, I think we all have experienced it when you've said something a little bit weird or something and then suddenly you get adverts. Once somebody said somebody was looking for a license to do gambling, a client, and the associate phoned me and just said, well, the best place to do it is Costa Rica. And I think I've never said Costa Rica in my life. I said, Costa Rica? He goes, yeah, Costa Rica. I said, well, okay, well, Costa Rica then. And then for months on Google, it was like, you want a holiday in Costa Rica or something like that. Or once I was in America, they had the bathtub in the hotel had a little door. And I was like, wondering if they thought I was getting so old, I needed the bathtub with a little door. And I just must have told somebody this. And for months, till this day, I still get these adverts quite regularly about, do I want to buy this or one of those things that go up the stairs so you don't have to walk. So, so I guess there is this targeted marketing in the West as well. So I don't know if I can move this because I can't see what's there. Just minimize it. Oh, yeah, but then I don't see these guys and I lose the feeling. So I guess then the next big thing is there's lots of other regulations in the background, which I don't think we have to go into in detail, but there were all these other things about, also some sectors, the automotive sector in particular has specific rules about what is important information, what's sensitive data, etc. And then the big thing, which I think for foreign companies was a real issue and is a real issue, is about the cross-border transmission of personal information. And so I think a lot of companies were worried about it. Like, how can I, large multinationals like a Siemens, or General Motors, or the big car companies, there's a lot of R&D projects that are going. Like Jerry mentioned, they've got thousands of employees. Can I easily transfer this, in both directions? And obviously the Chinese regulations, they're primarily concerned about Chinese data, going overseas. And so the question was, how do I certify it? And so basically, we'll go through it in a minute, but these regulations just came out recently. So it was about how to get the security assessment done, or the certification agents, or using a standard contract for cross-border transmission. And so again, very similar to the GDPR regulations. And so these all kick off on the 1st of September. So basically, I think, so maybe Atticus, do you want to just tell very briefly how the 3 different ways that you can send cross-border information overseas?
Yeah, sure. Thanks everyone joining this webinar. So, in terms of the pass, actually, currently the available pass now is just 2. So it's government assessment and also standard contract. For the government assessment is now we are talking about, today is 1st September. Actually, just, so this day is also a big day in China because all the children go to school. So the families and parents get a great relief because the kids has stay at home for 5 months. So that's that story. So for the government assessments, that's basically, we will go to details in the next stage when I talk about this. And it's just, for example, if you transfer the massive data outside of China, currently there's a threshold. For example, you have dealing with in China more than 1 million individual personal information. This is calculated based on the head count, not the head of the the individuals, not the piece of information. And also, for example, if you transfer the important data outside China, they also go to the government assessments. The important data is not something that we can think about, oh, in our business, in our company, whether this is important or not. Actually, it's a codified term on the PRC law. It's referred to those data that's referred to national security or public security or public interest. All those affect the massive individuals or the public. So if you transfer all those data, important data, you need to go to the government assessments. And also there's another concept, for example, the CIL we call is critical information infrastructure. So if you operate all those information infrastructure and any data, personal information or important data, you have to go through all those government assessments. This is the one that we discussed today. This already took effect. So for the government assessment, the other one I would like to mention is standard contract. Standard contracts is I think is the kind of equivalent, on the GDPR is the SEC. So I think China, adopt a lot of the terminology or thinking of the, the mechanism on the GDPR. So we also have the standard contract. So basically, the standard contract is applies to the situation that the thresholds for government assessment has not been met. And for example, you just transfer limited amount of personal information. You are not transfer important data outside of China. So it goes to the standard contract, pass. And for this pass, and the China side, the way we call it is data provider, and to the offshore entity, the data receiver, they sign a contract. There's a lot of details that the government issued the standard contract format that you have to comply with. For example, that any contract you sign in terms of those data transfer cross-border cannot different or conflict with the standard contract. So that's basically the rule for the standard contract. For the current status, the standard contract regulations are still in the draft form. In late June, there's a draft, and after 1 month, solicitation for the comments of the public, that the government now is work out on the final version. It has not been issued yet, but we understand that this will be soon issued because China want to make sure all those mechanism is in place very soon. In the middle, we mentioned the special certification. This method is specified in the PIPL. However, at the moment, there's only very low level standard. The draft standard mentioned this, special certification. The draft says it applies to, for example, in the multinational companies, the group, the transfer among the intercompanies from China to offshore headquarters or subsidiary or affiliates. And also, they also mentioned that this applies to the extraterritorial effects. So we can discuss this later on the extraterritorial effects in later detail. But it's in a very short summary for the special certificates. It's just very low level draft. The government has not issued any higher formal regulation on that. So this is need to be weighted and see how this will play.
Okay. So I think just to like as a high level. So I think the cross-border transfers are going to be regulated. The thresholds sound high, but they're not really high. I mean, 1 million data subjects in Luxembourg would be a lot. In China, not so many. And then I think it's 100,000 for the normal kind of personal information. And then sometimes I think it's even like 10,000 in some other cases. So I think that's kind of important. I think most people will not be critical infrastructure information organizations, CIO. So very few, I don't know if any Western companies would. And in any event now, you would find out because your industrial sector authority will tell you if you're a CIO. So a lot of people are worried, am I a CIO? No, you're not. So I think that's the main thing. And then I think with the standard contract, I don't think there's been much taken because this is also new, but I think most foreign companies, you should just have a good shot at trying to comply. We've talked to GDPR experts in Europe and they believe GDPR is actually impossible to fully comply with. So it's just a question of how close can you come to
about good faith.
Yeah, but I think it's always changing. It's difficult to always be. So even GDPR lawyers say, it's not easy, but perhaps the American clients that we have, like I say, not one of them has raised an issue. So yeah, that's perhaps more concerning. So next one. Okay, so I think maybe Jerry, I'll just on the universities and education. Where we've seen it was mostly Australian universities. We had a few clients of Australian universities, and they were worried about the recruiting of students because they work with agents in China, but they also have a lot of information directly, and these kind of things. And okay, remote session delivery, I haven't looked into that. But Jerry, do you want to tell us a little bit about what the common concerns are for education and universities?
Yeah, no problem, Mark. So first of all, one of the typical scenario we set out is about universities' cooperation with Chinese local recruitment agencies. So normally agencies will take the charge of like collecting or processing the personal information of Chinese students, whether they are like former students or like candidates or even applicants. So basically they will be the first layer in China as the data collector who facing with the Chinese individuals, the students. So that's why we normally would recommend the universities to put in place some contractual arrangements so that the agencies will provide their reps and warranties as to their compliance under the PIPL. For example, so once the agencies collected the personal information, they will need to transmit to the university. So under this transmission process, the agency will need to make sure that such transmission has obtained sufficient consent from the Chinese students as personal data subjects. So this is the first thing. And secondly, the transmission between the agency and the university will normally constitute cross-border transmission. So theoretically speaking, the agencies as the Chinese domestic providing party, that they will be the responsible party who need to fulfill all the like data export rules to like the filing of the SCC or even the government assessment. But practically, we want to mention that Western universities will also need to provide certain assistance to the agency. For example, they will need to like cooperate with the agency to enter into a China version standard contract, and also for internal assessment purposes, which is also concerned by the Chinese authorities, the university as the overseas recipients of the data, so they will provide necessary information such as their security measures and how they would like commitment to protect the personal information, to properly use the personal information. So all these factors will be taken into consideration into the internal assessment carried out by the domestic agency. So this is basically for the recruitment scenario. And second one is about student information system. So basically, if a university is overseas Western universities are using their own SIS hosted in the headquarters, so this is basically the university will need to follow the data protection laws of the jurisdiction where the university is located. But why we mention this point is about recently we observed that more and more Western universities or even other like high school, elementary school, so other educational institutions, they are starting to set up Chinese local branches in China so that all the courses sessions will be delivered on site within China. So some of the universities or schools, so pending the quantity of the students, they might deploy a localized student information system in China. But this kind of localized system will first of all be connected with the overseas system hosted by the headquarters. And secondly, as more common to see is that employees or personnel from the headquarters will need to remotely access the Chinese hosted system. So we want to advise that the remote access, providing remote access to overseas accounts or users will also be identified as a cross-border transmission in China. So under this scenario, so the Chinese local branch will probably be the party similar to the agency, so to fulfill all the obligations under the data export rules. And similarly, the headquarters will need to provide some necessary assistance to the local branches.
I think the UK also has a lot of these organisations who do exams, like the music exams, and because of COVID, I guess they're going to be moving increasingly to online type things. I used to send academics or I forget what they're called, the people take these. No, this is better word for that. Anything, But anyway, there is some other better word. But so I guess those guys would be affected. And I think it's instructive that Sean, who put the PPT together, he found the SIS is from Colorado. So once again, the Americans are very loosey-goosey with their data. So anything else, Jerry, or we'll go to the...
Also another short topic is about VPN. So the use of VPN is actually particularly concerned during the last 2 or 3 years due to the COVID-19. So Chinese students, the number of Chinese students, they cannot make themselves be physically in the campus, so that they have to receive all the courses on-site remotely through a system provided by the university. So what we see is that quite a few university systems are constructed based on the function Google or based on the Google function. So unfortunately, the Google is somehow largely blocked in China. So this will cause the Chinese students will have to use a VPN to access and use the university system. So as a matter of fact, that the VPN in China is generally only available to corporate clients. And even so, practically there are a lot of gray area for Chinese students to use a VPN by paying a little bit money or to share with the VPN channel with others. So, but this is legal, from a legal perspective, this is a very gray area. This is definitely causing additional burden to the Chinese students. So as we have been frequently asked by some university on the use of VPN. So depending on the long-term plan of that university, so it might be considerable to set up a mirror site in China, so that this will bring huge convenience for if the quantity is big so for Chinese students to use the university's system. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great, thanks. So I think, Atticus, about retail, we've got some people here in the retail consumer space. So I guess, this one is, I guess the big thing is that extraterritoriality, because a lot of, consumer companies sell cross-border e-commerce and think that they're beyond it. And then also a bit about, the rights that Chinese consumers have, which I think are often misunderstood, that Chinese consumers, they're quite active and ready to have a fight with everybody. So maybe just briefly, can you just tell us a little bit of an overview of what you're hearing from consumer-facing companies?
Yeah, sure. So I think for consumer or facing industry or retail, e-commerce, so this just facing a lot of consumers. Probably today that we discuss more a bit, on the cross-border e-commerce, and in such situation that is special because there's a concept of, as Mark mentioned, that extraterritorial effect. Many of our clients that they do the online, cross-border business. They had those data server hosted in their headquarters offshore. But they just sell the products to Chinese consumers. So this type of will be data transfer. The Chinese consumers will put their data onto the website and their address, but so the company can deliver the package. So this is people asked whether this is caught by the PRPL because this data collection activities is outside of China. So this is clear that on the PRPL now there's a extraterritorial effect. So similarly to the GDPR, they have a kind of those long reach for compliance. Also very similar to the concept of GDPR, that's for the extraterritorial effect, as long as the data collection information activities, while processed outside of China, but it's the purpose to sell goods to Chinese consumers and or to analyze the behavior of Chinese consumers. So that's also be caught by the PRPL. So in connection with this, people are thinking, well, this will have to comply with the PRPL, but what should I do? So currently, for example, the topics we are discussing is cross-border transfer. So there's whether, for example, if there are a lot of consumers, whether we should go to the PRC authority to submit this, go through this government assessment. So far, the first thing is clear that this extraterritorial effect applies, but so far there's no implementation rules in place. How this type of data collection will be handled. So for the moment, the government assessment approach has not clearly say that the cross-border data collection activities will be caught, and there's no clear information or the interpretation.
Atticus, so I think that the issue there, just so people think about it, because I don't think the Chinese government's going to go after somebody who's selling a few bars of soap or something. But I think the bigger risk for cross-border e-commerce companies is that the big data collectors who are under a lot of pressure, we didn't mention it all, but there's lots of internet platform specific regulations. So it'll be the Alibabas and the Tencents and these guys and JD, they will probably self-monitor because they don't want to get in trouble with the Chinese authorities. And so, if you've got a Tmall global store or whatever, they might defenestrate you. They might say, if you can't prove that you're protecting consumer information, you'll be kicked off. Like they did with everybody who was, selling, pirated goods. It's a bit different now because these are legitimate companies. But I think that's the risk, isn't it? That not that they will try to go to the UK to enforce it, but rather they might curtail your e-commerce activities via the platforms?
Yeah, I think you're right. And for those, there's an issue of the, implementation or enforce. But on the PRPL, there are also mechanism or, provisions that for those, type of extraterritorial, if, this applies, they need to the company, the offshore company has a representative or entity established in China to, to handle those data things. And also this information needs to be filed with the China authority. At the moment, this mechanism has not in place ready. As Mark mentioned that, currently a lot of consumers that are, international brands, they run this business in the Tmall or, Jingdong, all those platforms. Generally, this, the compliance obligation for those platforms, if you run business in these platforms, are within the Alibaba or Jingdong or those platforms, and they have those privacy policy. But there's also data exchange between the international brand with Jingdong, all those platforms. But in certain circumstances, or we should say that in many of circumstances, the customers may submit the information directly to the store, or they to comply with, they just submit this information to the platform. So there's as Mark mentioned, the platform has the obligation to monitor all the compliance, and also there's an arrangement or contract should be in place between the brand and the Tmall to make sure there's data privacy also be compliant with.
Yeah, and maybe just briefly, because Mark is keen to ask some questions at the end, but just briefly, so about these consumer-facing brands, they're going to have to actually segregate data and give people certain rights over their data. So maybe just very briefly, what kind of requirements are you seeing that people have to comply with?
You mean the brand, the consumers have to give the
give their kind of consent, but they also have the right to recall the information or delete it and things like that.
Yeah, indeed. So PRPL does give the the individuals the right to consent. This is the main concept. The consent you should obtain when you can collect those information. But if the data collection, those handling or processing is based on consent, the consumer has the right. So as Mark mentioned, they have to to withdraw their consent. So if they withdraw, so you cannot process their data. However, if this you continue to provide the basic service without their data, you can continue to process that, and this also will not affect the activities that you already handled before this withdrawal. And also, as Mark mentioned, that Chinese consumers now has more kind of incentive to access their rights. And if there's any breach, the PRPL also grant the individuals the right to sue the data handler or data controller. So they give the consumers more protection on the PRPL.
Yeah, I think also, just here very briefly, I think this profiling person, which is something which I think is fantastic. So, like I was talking about before with Costa Rica, so they're not able to use your information to come up with different pricing. So variable pricing is not allowed, which I think is very good and fair. And then I think, with the consumers, we've seen it for a number of years now, but Chinese consumers, they're very active and very happy to start suing people. And they're also very active on social media. So I think, it's a bit like the universities. I don't think online stuff or the university stuff, I don't think they're intrinsically very risky, but they're risky because there'll be a scandal one day where something gets hacked, and then the brand will be attacked for not safeguarding Chinese consumers' privacy. And if you're a European brand and you're treating Chinese consumers in a different way, like if you do protect European consumers in a way that's similar to the PIPL, but you don't with the Chinese, I don't want to be involved in your e-commerce thing. That would be a big hassle to deal with. Yeah. It'd be like if you're working for an e-commerce company and you turn up to an event wearing an obviously knockoff Burberry shirt. So yeah, but anyway, we will continue to the next one. Atticus, we're going to have to stay with Atticus because I know Atticus is a fan of automotive. Maybe just briefly, Atticus, can you just give us a bit of an overview of automotive?
Yeah, I think for automotive, for traditionally, those cars is not much related to the data thing. But with the rising of the smart car, a lot of data is collected with those sensors. Maybe all of you know, many of you know that a very famous brand in China, they cause a lot of caution to the government because those vehicles have those sensors and also LiDAR or all those recorder video, so they can go anywhere and just collect all those information and they transfer those data back to the headquarters. So that's cause a lot of caution to the Chinese government. So last year the Chinese government issued the regulations on the auto industry. So that's require if you companies that collect those information, for example, the facial information of pedestrian or private cars and car plates and outside vehicle, all those data are categorized, classified as important data. And if you transfer those data, important data outside of China, it has to go to the government assessment. So that basically this government is discouraged the transfer of those information because they're worried about the powerful capability of the smart cars vehicles. They can collect so much information that can jeopardize China's security, national security. I think that's the main reason for the regulation was issued last year. In terms of the PIPL, I think maybe this is for the automaker that has a lot of obligations because they are also consumer facing. We are assisting a couple of manufacturers, auto manufacturers in this compliance project. So there's a lot of work to do. For example, they have many consumers information in a data site, and in the early stage they had the server only offshore, and the consumer information and the employee information all sent to the offshore. And currently for the cross-border requirements, there could be very easily to reach this threshold, and it has to go through this government assessment. And also, in addition to that, for the automaker, some of them is large in China, even they are multinational companies, because they have run business in China for so many years, they have those large consumer base. So they are be categorized as a CIO. One of our clients already been notified as a CIO. So as Mark mentioned earlier, that maybe many of the international clients in China running up business may not be CIO, but for the auto sector, if you are a manufacturer, that could be kind of major factors that could be considered by the governments to be a CIO. So one of our clients be identified as the CIO. So in terms of CIO, there's an obligation that all the data, regardless of personal information or important data, you have to stay in China. And so there's a localization requirement. If you transfer outside of China, then you have to go to the government assessment. And also, within the smart car, there's currently China already developed those autonomous driving, and the many cities that develop those technology. So there's could be assume or manage imagine that very soon that there's no drivers in the vehicle in some of cities testing area, and there's all passenger information may be collected. So there's also requirements on the privacy in car, to how to get the consent of consumers. This protect their rights when they using the smart cars. So basically, that's the general situation in China. This could be a lot of work, but that's the in compared to other sectors, this important data nature may be another layer of complexity.
Yeah. So thanks. So I think like with automotive, just to recap. So I think firstly, it's a very key area. It's the one sector which has had more regulation than any other sector. And I think firstly, one of the reasons is it's been sensitive for a long time because of electronic maps. So, there are things which are in China that are not very sensitive outside of China, but mapping is very, very sensitive. And so, because of this, and then with the autonomous car, that really notches up the mapping element. And I think if you're in that area, you not have to be just worried about these rules, you have to be worried about state secrets, which is something we haven't discussed. But state secrets only affect very few companies. But if it does, it can really knock you out. And then I think, I think Atticus may not have touched on it, data outside the car. One of the issues of these autonomous cars, okay, you can get the customer to say, okay, but how do you get consent from people outside of the car? Or if only one person pays. So I think there's a lot of complexity here. So that's why it's an interesting sector. Okay, so back now to Jerry with medical technology. So Jerry, do you want to give us a brief update?
For sure, Mark. So for the medical technology, so first of all, we wish to bring up three different types of data that is identified by PRC law. So first one is the human genetic resource data. So the so-called human genetic resource is mainly related to like human gene or like human tissues and blood and the data around it. So in this regard, so basically foreign companies and even for their like Chinese subsidiaries with foreign investment, so they are in principle cannot acquire the human genetic resources of Chinese individuals. So there are some very limited exceptions, like cooperation with the qualified Chinese domestic institutions. But in general, so foreign companies cannot. It will be rather difficult for foreign companies to acquire the Chinese human genetic resource data. So not to mention the cross-border of such data. So if any company is aiming for this type of data, our answer would probably be no. So the second one is the population health information. So this is a typical type of important data as defined by PRC law. And the consequence is that any export, any cross-border transmission of important data will definitely trigger the government assessment. And since the government assessment start from today, but we do not have too many statistics can prove that our guess, but we do anticipate that at this early stage, so the government authorities will be very prudent when approving the export of important data other than like personal information. So this is our guess. The third one is about sensitive personal information. This is particularly related to an individual. So, for example, the medical records and the diagnosis information, etc., etc. So this would require like the companies, foreign companies, the data processors, to be more transparent through their privacy policy to explain all the details of what kind of activities they will do and what's the potential impact that would be caused against the individual's right and interests. This is the basic the three type of data. And the second one is about medical cooperation with hospitals in China. So this is a rather big topic. I will try to make it short. The most notable point is that the hospitals and the medical institutions in China, they are likely to be identified as a CIO, as mentioned by Atticus. So as a result, so they will be very restricted to providing the data to third party and to foreign companies. So if a foreign company is making cooperation with Chinese hospitals for research, for study, or for other commercial projects, so these companies will need to bear in mind that their local partners will be restrained on this on their data processing activities, and therefore certain works or most of the works will need to be carried out in China. The third one is about smart medical devices or sensors. So what we want to talk about this scenario is about such kind of products will normally be accompanied by an app. So as mentioned by Mark at the very beginning, so app is highly regulated, highly administrated by Chinese authorities. So over the last few years, more than thousands of apps were being caught by MIT, the Chinese authority. So for the insufficient protection of personal information. So normally when we are looking at the compliance requirements of apps, so basically they will need a very well drafted privacy policy, a very appropriate place to put such privacy policy to deliver to the users. And also the apps operators need to strictly observe the minimum necessity scope of personal information to be processed, which is otherwise which is separately specified in some industrial regulations. So there are a lot of work to do in relation to ensure the compliance of the app in China. So last but not least is about if the app is transferring the data to overseas. So as we mentioned, this would be sensitive personal information. It's not only requires the separate consent from the individuals, but also subject to a very say 10,000 individuals sensitive information will trigger the government assessment procedures. So that's it, Mark. Back to you, Mark.
Yeah. So I think also, I think one topic which we didn't discuss very in detail is that we have a few clients. One client was making hearing aids, and the hearing aids could be adjusted online digitally, so you could insert them. And the question there was, this could only really be done in Europe, not in China, but how could they get around it? And the question was whether, because the personal data, once it goes overseas, it can be either, as it is, or it could be pseudonymized, so you can't tell who it is. It could be anonymized, or it could be statistical data. So I won't go into detail on that because it really depends on the kind of information, the kind of application. But these are some of the kind of issues you have to grapple with. So I think if you're handling anything which is biometric about someone's health, we didn't discuss it here, but somebody's financial type of stuff, all of these things you need to look into a bit of detail. Thanks, Jerry. So now to Mark Headley to give us a few questions on the time remaining.
How long have we got left? We've got 20, somewhere. Okay, 5 minutes. We've got 5 minutes. Okay. Should we just see if there's any questions coming through on Q&A?
Is it chat or where is it?
So if you just go on Q&A, we'll look at those ones first.
Go right?
No, just too far. It says Q&A.
They often say I go too far right.
Okay, so maybe.
What's the
position when there's a UK medical health provider? Should we take the first one from Nicola? So regarding standard contracts, I forget who was speaking about
Atticus.
Atticus. Having adopted a similar approach to GDPR, has this been updated to reflect the new requirement to conduct international data transfer risk assessments and defining of supplemental measures as part of the standard contract? Atticus, are you able to tell me that?
I just say yes.
Yeah. Okay. So for the standard contract, that's basically it's adopted similar to the approach similar to the GDPR. Some of the contents are even the similar, but China, for the for the content of the contract has its some of the provisions are different. For example, China is very keen to know the type of data, the information where located, and also the offshore entity, the receiver, a lot of information on that part. If I understand correctly, this information reflect the new requirement to conduct international data transfer risk assessments. Under China's draft standard contract, there's also assessments on that part, and also this has not been going. This is just need to go to the filing process with the PRC, but also there's also one of the requirement on the standard contract is the changes of the offshore regulations on data protection, whether this will affect the protection of the data. So that's part. If there's a changes, this also needs to be refiled with the government authority. I'm not sure this is exactly the question asked.
Okay, well, I guess we can also follow up on that afterwards. If anyone has any other questions, do pop them into the chat or raise your hand. I've got loads of hands going up here. So I think Torsten was first.
Yeah, I have one question regarding the medical healthcare data, because it seems that like from the presentation that it only applies to like healthcare businesses or kind of medical equipment producers, but I was just wondering, because a lot of like businesses, whether it's education or like even like consumer brands, they often like now ask like users like whether they have any disabilities or whether they kind of have any other like impediments or things like this. And I just feel, okay, there's where's the boundary, or where is the threshold where?
Well, I think it's the kind of data. It's not who's asking for the data, it's the kind of data. So if that falls within personal information data, then it's caught. Whether you're a nosy restaurant asking if you've got allergies. I don't know if allergies would be a sensitive personal data, but if somebody was asking for your medical history, an insurance company wants to ask your medical history, it's the data that's protected. Okay. It's not the.
So it's not like a yes or no. If you just click on yes, then
No. It depends. If they're collecting the data, I mean, what data you're giving them.
Okay.
I think that is affected.
So also, you keep talking about whether something's classed as being important data or not. I mean, how are there very specific definitions of what we mean by that? Because that to me seems pretty vague.
Yeah, it's complicated. I think Atticus talked a bit about like important data depends on the industry type. It depends on the type of data. So I think it's maybe you guys chip. I'll just do a quick answer. You guys chip in. But things which are like health, data, like you were just mentioning, if people were talking about their blood pressure and all this kind of stuff, financial data, biometric data, data relating to children under 16. What other, in an auto sector, it's all kind of like geolocation data. You guys have anything additional to add?
Yeah, and also there's many industries, for example, this transportation, as Mark mentioned, this while the survey and the mapping data, this maybe classified as another type of data, but there's in the mechanism there should be a kind of catalog for the survey and the map data. This will be classified as important data. So the important data concept in China is this will be issued on the sector basis. So every regulator on these sectors, they will issue their sectors important data. This will be a huge work.
Yeah, and like as a follow-up to that, like so we've got an office in Shanghai with however many staff, and for example, things like our HR department is mostly based in the UK, our finance department is mostly based in the UK, and they certainly control like the master data of payroll and all the rest of it, even if it's managed kind of locally in terms of actual payment from China. So is that counted then as important in your internal data?
I think that's the third question.
Yeah.
Right.
So you don't just copy shirts, you also copy other people's
Just psychic. I haven't read it.
Okay, I think Atticus, you mentioned that a bit before. This is just a bit about the transferring of data from Chinese employees to the HQ. And sometimes it's more complicated because the HQ uses a third-party provider to process stuff. Do you want to give just a quick answer on that?
Yeah, I think generally the employment data will not be categorized as important data. It's just when we understand what is important data, it's just more related or linked to the national security, general public interest. All those things will be categorized as important data. for the general, employee data is generally we understand is not will be categorized as important data. The only exception is in the auto industry that is categorized as the 100,000 of individuals' information are categorized as important data. So that's the only exception so far, classified as the important data. Otherwise, in our understanding, for employee data is unlikely to be treated as important data.
And presumably that's where the thresholds come in then as well. So if you're dealing with data which is in lower numbers of data sets, then you would fall below the thresholds that would trigger the
Reviews.
Yeah.
But maybe I add one point for the important data, and important data is if the data is categorized, deemed as important data, recognized as important data, it's not depends on the volume. It could be any piece of those important data. But for the other non-important data, for example, the employee's personal information, it depends on the volume, how many people involved. So that's the difference.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to pick up the other question.
Yes, so any insights on data from the financial sector, financial industry? Is any special, requirements on, especially trading securities or other financial products, and traders located in China and trading information? Are there any special regulations on that?
Yeah, I can pick up this question, if you don't mind. So basically, when we consider this issue, this question, we are starting to, first of all, to think of whether the entity has any special identity under the PRC law. For example, they are like qualified, licensed, like financial institutions. They are particularly regulated by the PBOC industrial regulations, and they have some very quite famous JRT 2020, the industrial standard that defining the financial data and like dividing the financial data to 3 different degrees, and somehow to put some restrictions on the cross-border transmission of financial data. So if any company is qualified, licensed financial institutions in China, so they have to obey these special rules. But for ordinary companies, it's also normal for companies to collect certain financial data. For example, so automotive companies, when they're selling cars, when they are asking their customers whether they have enough money to buy the car or to undergo the loan process, they will collect some financial data. For this kind of data, so we will go for the sensitive personal information. So first of all, the transparency through the privacy policy and the separate consent, and also if any further activities is to be carried out against such data, like cross-border transfer, like to sharing this data to others, or to entrusting other parties to processing the data on their behalf. So basically, they will all need quite special consents requirements. So this need to be, and this consent, like forms, letters, notices, will need to be prepared in advance. Yeah.
I had another question actually, was just about the process itself for submitting the data to the authorities. Is there specific requirements around that, like the format that the data has to be in? Because I think that a lot of companies, when they're doing cross-border data transfer, it may actually be in real time. If they're utilizing cloud services and so on. So how to address that? Like, how long does the security assessment take, and what's the general process? Is it regional, or is there a national? Is it directly to the CAC? How does it all work in practice?
Yeah, the volume of data, especially for personal data, to be exported. So first of all, government is calculating the value, the volume for a 2 years period. So it's basically if the to trigger the stress of the volume threshold for a government assessment. So they will consider whether the personal information of like certain volume has been transmitted since the January 1st of previous year. So this is generally a 2-year period for companies to consider when they would trigger the volume threshold of the government assessment. So it is also like Mark raised a very good question. So many companies, they are intending or they are implementing the real-time transmission. So what we see from the latest notification from the government authority on the authority assessment things. So this would at least the company will at least need to like give the authority estimated number of the transmission. So this is rather important for the authorities to approve the so-called cross-border transmission. So this would require companies to think of more and mapping their own activities on the estimation.
So I think Mark was maybe also kind of hinting, today's the 1st of September. Let's say you're a company and you are transferring a lot of data and you clearly fall within it and you should get this security assessment or whatever, but you haven't because they haven't really started yet and it's going to take time. What do? Do you stop transferring the data or you continue working on it and submit as soon as you can? What do people do now?
Yeah. I think the rules for government assessment, they provide a 6 months so-called grace period, but for companies, allowing companies to rectify their practice. So we don't think it's strict necessary for companies to cease the cross-border transmission, but provided that companies actually actively prepare for the assessment.
And for most people, it will be a filing, so it's not like an approval. For most people, it will be just a filing. So getting the piece of paper in would be important, I guess.
Yeah. Well, another important information we received from the authority yesterday is that the assessment, when a company is applying for assessment, so the government assessment, but so as statutory required, the company will firstly to finish an internal self-assessment, and such self-assessment will need to be completed 3 months in advance of the submission of the application. So this would make the time even more tight. So the companies will have to like initiate their preparation work as soon as possible. Yeah.
They must have an army of people assessing. Maybe we'll just, we've got time for the last question on the chat. So if data transfer is under 10,000, we touched on this earlier, data is under 10,000, not considered sensitive or important data, do we still have to nominate a representative or do a government assessment?
Yeah, maybe I take this question. So if the 10,000 are not considered as sensitive information, personal information, so this is not, be caught by the government assessment approach. But it's still, if, for example, if transfer those personal information outside of China, this has to go to the SEC approach. But for the important data, as mentioned earlier, this not depends on the number or piece of information. Is as long as there's a very minor important data you transferred abroad, then this will be caught by the government assessments. And also, as to the nominated representative, I think I'm not sure if this the transfer. I don't know whether this is related to cross-border extraterritorial effect when you mention representative. If we just go through the process, for example, how to do the filing, I think at the moment, as Jerry mentioned yesterday, the government issued the kind of guidance, how you make the application, do the filing, and there's also forms that you have to fill in, and also there's self-assessments template that you need to fill in. There's a information that need to fill is, for example, in China, if you have entity in China, you need to submit the legal representative names, and also there's for example, if there's international citizens, that maybe you need to submit the photocopy of the passport. And for the people that handle this paperwork, this not necessarily mentioned that it has to be the employee of the company. This is thing. And the other, for all those government assessment, you need to do the DPIA. If we use the terminology on the GDPR. So for this DPIA, you can do by yourself, or you can engage a law firm to do that for you. So that's I'm not sure this is covered all the questions in last one.
I think, Mark, we've got a lot of information, and also we've got checklists and a lot of information, also sector specific.
Yeah.
So if anybody drops us an email, we'll be happy to send the information to you.
Maybe we can wrap. Do we have another slide with contact details on here? So maybe we'll wrap up the Q&A. I think obviously there's a lot of questions on this topic. Some of them are quite specific. So I'm sure Mark, Atticus, and Jerry would be very happy to for you to get in contact with them and with any questions you may have. I can see there's YouTube and some blogs, all sorts of things there.
I look the happiest. Atticus looks second happiest. Jerry doesn't look
so I don't think I think that probably wraps things up. So thank you for those who managed to stay with us for the full session online. We'll release you to your day, and just thanks again to the team here for organising. I think it's been a really instructive session. I'm sure that we'll regroup and do this again in a few months when the next lot of regulation comes out, but hopefully this might be towards the end of it, but we'll see. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Stop this. How does one stop this?
Stop share. Maybe.
Stop share, or just the thing though?
And then we can
And then
just
end
exit out. Yeah.
It seems so final. Do you have a